What's up, world? Welcome back to another episode of Just Grow It, the podcast. I'm your host, Big City Gardener, and today we are talking about the garden pest that I hate the most. And I don't really use the term hate because I don't really hate much, but I hate the squash vine borer. In this episode, we're going to talk about what it is, what plants it attacks, and give you a few tips on how to prevent it or deal with it. Let's get to it. Now, the squash vine borer, or the SVB, as I will call it in this episode, the SVB is a common pest that attacks most home gardeners. Well, that is if you are a home gardener who lives on the East Coast or down south. If you're lucky enough to live on the West Coast, the best coast, then you don't have to deal with the SVB. As a matter of fact, good friends of mine who live out in California, they tell me that they've actually never seen or had to deal with this SVB issue. They're so lucky. Anyway, the SVB is a black and orange moth. It kind of looks like a wasp, about a ½ inch long, that lays its eggs inside of your squash plants. Depending on where you live, you'll notice the SVB is extremely active towards the middle of spring to early June. So the SVB burrows its way into the stem of your squash plants. Here, they feed on the plant material inside of the plant and they block the water flow from the roots through the remainder of the plant. After about a month or so inside of your squash plant, the larva will burrow its way out of the plant and then dig itself into the soil where it will overwinter until the following spring. Often, by the time you realize that you even have an issue, it's too late. Plants like squash, pumpkins, gourds, zucchini, they are highly susceptible. Despite melons and cucumbers being in the same family as the other squash mentioned, they tend to be a lot more resistant of the SVB. And that's because watermelons and cucumbers, even though they belong to the same plant family, they're actually a different subspecies. When we talk about squash and we talk about the SVB, it usually attacks these 3 species of squash. So how do you know you're dealing with an SVB issue? The first thing you'll notice is what looks like sawdust at the base of the plant. Right where the soil meets the stem, you'll notice a hole and you'll see this brown looking material. This happens to be the frass or poop from the insect. If you notice a hole in your main stem, then you already have been affected by the SVB. One thing you can try to do, which I have not done successfully, is you can try what people refer to as the squash surgery. So grab your favorite clean pocket knife or kitchen knife, and then you are going to slice up the stem. You're going to cut the stem in half, opening it up. And then you are going to locate the larva inside of your stem, remove it, and then put the stem back together and hold it together with some sort of plant ties. Now, personally, I have never successfully removed the SVB larva from a squash plant. But I have heard people talk about it, so I figured I would share that with you. One thing that I have learned through my years of gardening is that it is extremely hard to prevent the SVB. And the main reason is because they tend to overwinter in the soil right there in your garden. They live in a cocoon state in your garden bed until it is warm enough for them to hatch. So now let's talk about some things we can do to help prevent SVB. The first thing you can do is till your garden. I personally practice no-till gardening, but I do know that if you till your garden, what you can do is move the cocoons to the top of the soil, and then hopefully if you have enough birds in your area, a bird will swoop down and pick up the cocoon, removing the SVB from your garden. Now, while that could potentially work, we all know that tilling your garden disrupts that microbial situation that we have going on. So if there's another way to prevent SVB, I would recommend that instead of tilling your garden. The second thing you can do to help prevent having to deal with SVB is to simply be active in your garden daily. By being active in our garden daily, we can make sure that we check our squash plants for the eggs. The eggs are laid at the base of the plant, right where the stem meets the soil. So, by being active in the garden, we can catch these eggs and these pests before they have the chance to hatch and work their way into our squash plants. Number 3, you can apply BT spray to your plants weekly. Applying BT spray to your garden can help kill any freshly hatched larvae and also help destroy the eggs. If you decide to go this route, you just have to be diligent and make sure you follow through. Applying BT one time will not ensure that you do not have a squash vine borer issue. Number 4, you can use diatomaceous earth. You can put a ring of DE around the base of your plant. By doing so, this will act as a sort of defense, helping to keep the larvae from entering your squash plant. Number 5, practice crop rotation. Since the squash vine borer likes to overwinter in our soil, by practicing crop rotation and not planting squash in the same place we did last year, we can limit our plant's exposure to the overwintered pest. Number 6, plant your squash as early in the spring as possible. Since the SVB is extremely active towards the end of spring and early summer, by planting our squash early in the spring, we can make sure that we still get a harvest before we start dealing with the SVB issue. Now, if you don't want to plant your squash early in the spring, you can do what I have done. I no longer really grow summer squash in the spring. As a matter of fact, it is now a staple in my fall garden. The SVB is no longer active after the summertime. I'm able to plant the summer squash later in July, after the SVB has already gone out and terrorized other people's gardens. So, if you haven't yet, try growing squash in the fall instead of the spring and summer. Number 7, apply row covers. Applying row covers can help limit the exposure of the plants to fully grown SVBs. Number 8, try planting different varieties. When people think of summer squash, they usually think of the zucchinis, the yellow crookneck squash, yellow straight neck squash, or anything like that. All of these squash belong to a specific subspecies of Cucurbita, known as Cucurbita pepo. This species is extremely vulnerable to the squash vine borers. So, if you're looking to plant a variety that has the ability to resist the squash vine borer, or a variety that squash vine borers tend to leave alone, then you want to look into growing the Cucurbita moscata. This includes a lot of varieties like the acorn squash, the butternut squash, or even the trombochino. One final thing you can try doing is using yellow traps. SVB, squash vine borers, are attracted to the color yellow. By using yellow sticky traps around the base of your plant, you can catch the SVB before they have a chance to penetrate into your squash plant. If you don't have any of the yellow sticky traps, you can try getting a bright yellow cup and filling it with a mixture of Castile soap and water. Then the SVB will be attracted to it, fall into the water, and hopefully drown and die. Another thing you can try doing is applying mulch to the stem of your squash plants. Placing mulch along the stem of your squash plant, or even wrapping the stem of your squash plant with something like foil. Try these 10 tips and let me know if they help you out with the squash vine borer issue. Thanks for checking out this episode of Just Grow It, the podcast. Before I let you go, I do have an ask. I'm trying to turn this into a top 10 gardening show. So what I need for you to do is to head over to wherever you listen to these podcast episodes and leave me a 5-star review or a comment. And afterwards, share this episode with anybody that you know who grows summer squash in their garden. All right, man, it's springtime. Let's do less of this, sitting inside of the house, and more of that, getting outside, getting our hands in the dirt to just grow it. You guys take it easy.